Hello, in this lesson, we will work on a 6th grade assessment and we'll work on our writing skills. So our reading here was an excerpt from Manhattan Transfer, which this is a novel. So considering we only have about a page and a half here, and also we had this blurb up top. So whenever you have an excerpt, you should know that you're reading a shorter piece of a longer text. So sometimes it might not make much sense. And it also might not have a definite ending, which can be kind of frustrating. But for the purpose of an assessment, we will do our best. And up here, it's going to give us that we are in the early 1900s. And we would also be able to assume here that this was during the Great Depression, which would have been in the 1930s. So we have our protagonist, Bud, and he is traveling to the big city to find work. So right away, we get our setting and our protagonist conflict. We could say character versus society because he is a person who is unemployed looking for a job. And as we're reading through here, we know some important notes. He had blistered feet. He was leaden tired. But when the ferry comes, he felt something warm and tingling shoot through his veins. We could assume here that he is excited about the opportunities of finding a job. And we have a young man Glance moved up from Bud's swelled shoes to the red wrist that stuck out from the frayed sleeve of his coat, past the skinny turkey's throat and slid up quickly into the intent eyes under the broken visored cap. This describing Bud, we can really see that he's not in the best state. His clothes are pretty torn. He's described as kind of sickly, blistered feet, leaden tired, and a red wrist. That can't be good. Not very healthy, we have him here. And then the violinist is having this conversation with him, asking him how to get to Broadway. So that's going to be New York City. And he walked between the coal wagons and over a dusty expanse of street towards yellow streetcars. A trembling took hold of his knees. He thrust his hands deep in his pocket. Now, that's our question. Our question's going to ask, read the sentence from paragraph 6, a trembling took hold of his knees. What effect does this have on the tone of the story? Now, tone and mood are similar, as those are going to be our feeling terms. Tone would be the author's feeling, where that one's kind of set throughout the whole story. Whereas mood is just like your mood. How do you feel when you read the text? So mood can change from reader to reader, and mood can change from each section of a text. Sometimes if you're reading a whole book, there might be a sad part or a happy chapter. So mood can kind of change to the reader's point of view, as long as you're backing it up with evidence from the text. Whereas tone, it's supposed to remain somewhat the same throughout a whole story. So now, if we want to know what effect that has on the tone of the story, we would have to know, we have to really read between the lines, because he gets there, and the very next thing after he puts his hands into his pockets is the word eat, seen on a big lunch wagon. We can assume that the reason he put his hands in his pockets is it's kind of a habit looking for money to see if you had money in your pocket. And when he gets, you look all in, feller, this would be kind of like, you look all in, feller. That might mean, this would be like an idiom, like a slang saying of the time, saying that he looks in kind of rough shape, we could say. And in the end, we know that the cook guy that was cooking his food, coming to the big city to look for a job, Bud nodded. The man flopped the eggs on the plate. I'm going to give you a bit of advice, fella. It won't cost you nothing. You go get a shave and a haircut and a brush and hayseeds out your soup before you start looking. You'll be more likely to get something. It's looks that count in this city. we might be able to assume that this guy gave him this food for free because he is being nice and he's saying he's going to slip him the advice and it won't cost him nothing. If he gave him the food for free, or maybe he did have, because he slid looking for the price list. So he might have gave him the food for free. There's no exchange of money. Because it'd be hard to assume he gave him it for free, because this would have been the Great Depression when a lot of people were struggling. So you wouldn't be very in business very long if your cook was giving out all the free food. So we're not really sure, but the diner cook was nice to him. So now when we want to say the tone, if you're trembling, that's definitely not a good feeling to have. Like that would be shaking. So for this one, we could say something along the lines of, here we have, so you would definitely always want to restate your question in your answer. So here we're going to restate the question. The sentence from paragraph 6 has an effect on the tone of the story because it shows how anxious Bud, the protagonist, is. Now, if we notice, anxious, nervous, you could say like downtrodden, depressed even, something to show this emotion of Bud being nervous because he's looking for money, he's hungry, he just got to New York City. Anything, and the idea that he's trembling is almost always, you could tremble with excitement, but in this case, we're assuming he's trembling with anxiety or nerves. And then we'll have, so that is how he answered the question. So when you're answering a tone question, you want to make sure you have some type of emotional word there. So anxious describes Bud's mood, the reader's mood. We're anxious for Bud, and the author's, the tone, right? An anxious tone. What's going to happen to this guy? He's all sickly getting to this city by himself. He doesn't have any money. We don't know if he has money. So now we have in paragraph 1. So now what we're doing here, these are going to be our 2 details. We're going to have in paragraph 1, Bud seems exhausted and is lost because he asks a random stranger where to go to get to his destination. That is adding to the anxiety because it is very nerve-wracking when you don't know where you are. You almost can like have even like a little panic there. Then we have when a trembling took hold of his knees. So notice I direct quoted our term here. He had just arrived in Manhattan. He was hungry, but he worried if he would have enough money to eat. Bud's trembling shows that the tone of the story is of worry and anxiety. So now I kind of added 2 here. We have worry and anxiety, which I just basically, anxious and anxiety would mean the same thing. I just worded it in different ways. And so here, we could even add, we know he was hungry, right? So basically we're saying here that the reason he was trembling is because he was worried he wouldn't have enough money to eat. You could even add a little follow-up because then he went into the diner. So this would be one way you could interpret this question. Now, if you notice, there's going to be 2 answers here because there's not just one answer for a tone type question. There's really never just one answer for any written response. As long as you're backing up your answer with those 2 details. Details are important. So here would be another way you could answer it. The sentence has a depressing effect on the tone. So now we're using the word depressing because Bud is trembling with worry. I would want to say this. In paragraph 6, a trembling took hold of his knees when he reached into his pockets and noticed he didn't have enough money for food. This makes readers feel sorry for Bud because he could starve. Readers were supposed to feel bad for Bud because he is from a poor countryside area. We could say we could say he's from a poor countryside area. I might actually want to edit what this answer had said. When we had said, because the diner owner said he was covered in hay seeds. Readers were supposed to feel bad for Bud because he is from a poor countryside area. And then we could say, when he sits down to eat, the diner cook comments that he needed to clean himself up because he was covered in hay seeds. That is another reason we would feel bad for Bud. You could even say, like, this shows that even the diner guy had pity for Bud. You could say, this shows how the diner worker had pity for Bud. And then I could make put a comma here, and then simply do my closing sentence, adding to the story's depressing tone. And that would be 2 different examples of written responses you could write for this answer. You could go with the depressing, sad, or you could go with the anxious. You could also, if you wanted to, say there was a hopeful tone, which sounds really crazy because we literally just said it was a depressing tone and an anxious tone. But with the right evidence, you could say that the part about he felt something warm and tingly shooting through all his veins. You could say that that shows excitement. So that even though Bud is in not a very good state, you could say here that it was still hopeful because of this line here. Just, you could really just use one line. Well, you would need 2 examples. You could use, the other one would be when he gets there, and you could use the last one, that the diner guy gives him this advice and leaves on more of a hopeful tone. So you could find, if you could just find 2 or 3 pieces of evidence, you could have a totally different tone for your answer if you wanted. But really, with a story like this, the depression, the anxiety, the nervousness, that could be probably your best because there's the most evidence to support that. But there's still evidence you could say was hopeful. Now, this one is going to be a little bit trickier here because it's going to ask us, why does Bud continue on his journey to New York City even though he is exhausted? So there's not much information about why Bud is going. We do have this from the top. It's telling us that he is going there to find work. But this blurb is it's like the pre-blurb from the excerpt, right? So we could say, we already know he's going there to get a job, right? We want to find the answers though in the text. So the fact he's asking people, how far is it to the city? That could be a piece of evidence that he's looking for a job, right? And then when he says, how do I get to Broadway? I want to find the center of things. So the center of things could show he's looking for, an area where there would be jobs to apply to, right? And here, and he says he's walking, he asks for the food, right? And he says, came down from upstate, I walk 15 miles. And here we get, this could be probably another good piece of evidence. The only other time they're going to say Bud's looking for a job is when the man asks him and Bud nodded. So that is our textual evidence from the text they gave us. Well, they gave us the top 2, obviously, but I like to use evidence from the story itself, right? So we could use this here. Now, when we go back, we would want to reword our question, right? And this one's sort of asking us to make an assumption about Bud. So, what do we call someone who never gives up and keeps trying to meet their goals? We would maybe call them determined. So we could say, Bud continues his journey to New York City, even though he is exhausted, because he is determined to find work. So this one is basically asking us, we could say, for a character trait. So when you get questions that are asking you, why does a character do something? Well, there could be a million different reasons. A character does stuff the same reason that we do stuff. They might be motivated, maybe they're really hungry, or maybe they're just fooling around, or maybe they like someone. There could be a lot of reasons. But here we're looking for a character trait to describe Bud. We could also say, because if you didn't want to have determined, you could just say because he is trying to find work. We could even add a little bit. We could say during the Great Depression, but we'll leave it here for now. So now we would say our details here. We would want one detail that shows he's exhausted. We could say the reader, well, we could say we want the one about determined, right? They're asking us about his exhaustion. So we want to show his determination. We could say he is determined because his feet are blistered. His feet were blistered. He was leaden tired. That just means really, really tired, right? The reader, or wait, we could say Bud. When Bud is on the ferry, his feet were blistered, but he still asked, we could say, a passenger how to get to the city center. And then we could say, when Bud is on the ferry, his feet were blistered, but he still asked a passenger how to get to the city center, which shows his determination to find employment. And employment would just be a fancier word for job. And then we could say, once Bud arrives to the city, he is asked by we could say, diner cook, if he is searching for work. That's basically our other detail, right? Once Bud arrives to the city, he is asked by a diner cook if he is searching for work, and he listens to the cook's advice on how to go about finding work. So technically, when we say listen to it as advice, right, we aren't exactly sure if he listened and went out and did the things the cook told him to, right? But here, it's not as though Bud's telling the cook to be quiet, he's eating. So we could say he's receptive. Receptive would mean someone who's willing to take advice, right? So that basically shows us that Bud is determined, and we also wanted to say that Bud is looking for a job. So this also is an important piece of evidence because we said in our answer here, he's continuing his journey because he's determined to find work. So if I want to read my question again, because look, we might have some typos here. When Bud is on the ferry, his feet were blistered. I also would put a little citation there because I did use a direct quote. So I would want to, that's from paragraph 1. So here I would put para 1. When Bud is on the ferry, his feet were blistered, but he still asked a passenger how to get to the city center, which shows his determination to find employment. Once Bud arrives in the city, he is asked by a diner cook if he is searching for work, and he listens to the cook's advice on how to go about finding a job. I said work, my bad. All right. And then if we were going to close this out with just a summarizing closing sentence, we could say Bud is motivated and determined to find a job in New York City because he traveled many miles in a, we could say in a, I want to say something about how he was. Like, his clothes were really torn. He was not in the most healthy state. So we could say, because he traveled many miles, we could just say, despite being tired, and he was almost like injured, or we'll just say extremely tired. Extremely tired. Or you could say, like, despite being in poor health. Actually, despite being in poor health might be the better one, because it was more than just being tired, I might say. Or let's say, despite being extremely tired and in poor health, he is determined. He's not going to stop. This would be our answer for why does Bud continue his journey. And we did add stuff about his characterization here. That's what we are focused on, his characterization. But you could also focus on, if you were going to focus on like the setting and say this was a time period when the Great Depression would have been a time people were desperate for work. We could have also said desperate for a job, because if he had to come all the way to New York City, then we're sort of assuming that there were no jobs where he was. And so that shows that he was in desperate need of a job because there was no jobs in his hometown where he was doing farming. So that would be a possible answer for why does Bud continue on his journey to New York City even though he is exhausted.